Hello and welcome to VVork. I'm Brian Watrous. This is the third in a 10-part video series in which we're exploring how to automate using VMware vRealize Orchestrator. As you can see in this video, what we're going to be doing is learning how to run Orchestrator workflows. Let's jump right in and do a demo. As you can see, I'm already logged in. I happen to be logged into Windows 7, but you can run Orchestrator from essentially any operating system. But I'm logged into Windows 7, and in order to log into Orchestrator, what I'm going to do is open up a web browser. I happen to be using Chrome. You can use other web browsers. I'm using Chrome though. And in Chrome, I'm going to type http:// and then I'm typing the fully qualified domain name for my Orchestrator server. So my machine is vRO and my domain name is vvork.info. So I'm going to hit enter. And you'll notice as I do so, it redirects a little bit here. So it's going to redirect to HTTPS. Notice it's also hitting port number 8281 /VCL. And on the screen that it takes us to, there are a number of different links that we can click on for all sorts of different purposes, including in the last video, if you watched that video, I showed you something called the Orchestrator Control Center. We don't need that right now. I'm going to assume your Orchestrator server is installed and configured. What we need is to make use of one of these links that allows us to log into Orchestrator using something called the Orchestrator client. As you can see, there's a link up top here and a link down here. Let me show you the one down below first. What happens when you click on this link here is it shows you that we have 3 different standalone applications that you can install in order to install the Orchestrator client. That client's going to allow you to log into Orchestrator, run workflows, create workflows, debug workflows, and so forth. And as you can see here, we have standalone clients for Windows operating systems, Mac OS X for Linux, and again, those are standalone applications that you can install. You just click on them and install them the usual sort of way. But there's also this other link up here, which I'm actually going to use because this one will work no matter what your operating system is that you're logged into. Now, I can log in by simply clicking on this link, but I'm actually going to use a little trick here. I'm going to right-click the link and choose Save Link As. And I'm going to go to, let me go to my desktop, and I'm going to save the file that it's downloading. Now you'll notice that the name of the file is client.jnlp. The first thing I'm going to do is actually change that name a little bit here to make it a tad bit more descriptive. So I'll type Orchestrator client.jnlp. Now the letter J in that name stands for Java. This JNLP file contains everything we need to run the Orchestrator client, and the Orchestrator client is a Java-based utility. Therefore, if I have the JNLP file, in theory I can run the Orchestrator client from any operating system as long as that operating system has Java. So whether that's Windows or Linux or Mac OS or other platforms, they all can run the Orchestrator client. Now if you don't already have Java on your platform, you'll want to go to www.java.com and download the appropriate version of Java for your operating system. Okay, so I'm going to save my JNLP file on my desktop, and I'll do so by clicking the Save button. So as you can see down at the bottom, Chrome tells me that it's downloading the file and it's now done. So I'm actually done with the web browser here, so I'll go ahead and close it. As you can see on my desktop, I now have an icon labeled Orchestrator Client, and I'm going to double click it to launch the Orchestrator Client. Now I'm getting a security warning. Are you sure you want to do this? The reason why I'm getting this is I'm using self-signed certificates in my lab environment. If I was using real certificates from a real certificate authority such as verisign.com or thought.com, I wouldn't see this. But I know I'm using self-signed certificates. I'm going to simply click the Continue button. So it starts running the Orchestrator client. And as you can see, we're greeted first by a login screen. Now on the first field, in the first field, as you can see, it's already pre-populated my Orchestrator server name and port number 8281. That's the port number that the Orchestrator server listens on. In the previous video, you heard about another port number, 8283. That's not for Orchestrator, that's for the Orchestrator control center. So this is the correct port number for our purposes here. I'm going to log in as the account VCO admin. That one's created by default. And by default, its password is VCO ADMIN, same as the username. Alternatively, I could log in using an Active Directory account or whatever type of authentication I configured in the Orchestrator tool called Control Center. I'll go ahead and click OK. Excuse me, not OK. It's not labeled OK. It's labeled Login. I'll click the Login button. And again, I'm getting a certificate warning. Ordinarily, I would actually click this button here to make this message go away in the future. For the purposes of being able to restart this video and let you see this in case this video blows up on my face, I'm not going to check that checkbox. Instead, I'm just going to click the Ignore button. So let's get logged in here. As you can see, the status messages show that we're logging in. It says it's opening a window, and sure enough, it's opened up a window. This is the Orchestrator client, sometimes called the vRO client. Now, first thing I'd like you to notice here is this drop-down list that has 3 different choices. By default, it has Run selected. These 3 different choices are different views that we can use in the Orchestrator client, depending upon what type of role we are playing. Now, I'm a developer, so I'm going to switch from the default Run view to Design view. If you're developing Orchestrator workflows, you'll probably spend the bulk of your time here. Notice as I do so what happens to these tabs. When you switch views, what you end up seeing is different tabs. Now, sometimes those tabs show up in different views. For instance, this first tab labeled Workflows will show up both in the Design view and Run view, and they're equivalent regardless which one you go to. So I'm going to go back to Design view and click on the Workflows tab. You'll notice that there are other tabs, and they each have a tooltip to tell you what they are. We're not going to talk about what all these other tabs are just yet, but instead, what I'd like to do is to explore this tab labeled Workflows. Now, actually, when you first come in here, it looks like this. This is the topmost entry in the Workflows tab. If you hit the triangle, it'll expand, and by default, what you're going to see is a folder called Library. You won't see this folder called VVork. That's a folder that I created. But everyone has a folder labeled Library, and that's where the standard library of workflows from VMware and our third-party partners, that library folder is where they stick their workflows. So just taking a quick peek in here, if we go into the library folder, all the different plugins that you install into Orchestrator have their own folder or folders in here. For instance, the vCenter plugin has all sorts of folders containing workflows that let you do all sorts of things to the objects in your vSphere infrastructure. For instance, I have virtual machines in my environment, and there are workflows. Let's just scroll down a little further here. There are workflows like under Basic, a workflow called Create Simple Virtual Machine. And there are workflows for doing other things to virtual machines like powering them on and cloning them. And there's workflows for things for far more than just virtual machines. And again, those are just the workflows provided by the vCenter plugin. There are lots of other plugins. But we're not going to go into the standard library, but rather I'm going to go into this folder that I've created called VVork. And in here I created a subfolder. You can create folders and subfolders. I created one called Hello World. And as you can see, I have a couple of very simple workflows in here. We'll start out by running this workflow called Hello World. Now, there are different ways to run workflows, but they all essentially start off by selecting the workflow that you want to run. And then if you want to, you can click this Start button here. That will start the workflow running. Or if you right-click a workflow, you'll notice that there are several different choices for running the workflow. This first choice and the button I just showed you are equivalent. And there's also a keyboard shortcut that allows you to start a workflow. So Control-R for Run. Again, there are some other choices here. We can talk about those later, but for our purpose here right now, I'm going to choose Start Workflow. Now, this is not a terribly exciting workflow, but it will illustrate a few things. One, we now know how to start a workflow. And notice that when we did so, we started off with this. This is a workflow, and it created for us something called a workflow token. That's this guy here. And you'll notice that this workflow token tells us information about the time when the workflow is running, reminds us the name of the workflow, and then it has this all-important icon, in this case a green check mark, to indicate the status or the state of this workflow. Now this workflow is done running and it succeeded, which is why we have a green check mark. If you select a workflow and go down to the tabs down below, little secret here, sometimes you won't see the tabs because you need to grab this resize handle and pull it up. Again, if you don't see these three tabs, go down to the bottom and grab the resize handle and pull up. But once you see the three tabs, the general tab gives you information about this particular run of that workflow. Each time you run the workflow, you'll get a new token, and that token is for that particular run. Each token will remind you the name of the workflow. It gives you this ID. That's a workflow ID. You don't have to worry about that right now. Actually, that's not a workflow ID. That's a workflow token ID. It tells you the business status. Again, we'll talk about these later, or you can join me in the classroom and we can talk about what all these are. But a few key things in here are the state field. The state field will say completed if we ran successfully. Again, completed and the green checkmark icon go hand in hand. They mean the same thing. But there are other states that your workflow may end up in, which I'll show you in a moment. And then down below we have the start time and end time of that particular time that we ran this workflow. So you run the workflow, you get a workflow token. If you run the workflow twice, you end up with 2 workflow tokens. And each workflow token has a general tab and a variables tab, a logs tab. We'll talk about those other 2 in a moment. But what I'd like to do is next show you what happens if we run a workflow that encounters a problem. So again, I'm going to run this workflow. You learned 3 techniques for how to do that before. I'm going to do it this time by clicking on this Start Workflow button. And notice this time when I run the workflow, it immediately blows up. Now that was actually intentional, as you might have guessed from the name of this workflow. I designed this workflow so that it would blow up. And I did so because I want you to see a workflow token for a failed workflow. So this red circle with the white X in it indicates that the workflow is no longer running and it failed. Furthermore, over here, we haven't talked about this thing over here yet, but this is called the schema. And without going into a lot of detail right now, what the red highlighting is doing here is letting us know where in our workflow, or more accurately, where in this schema our workflow failed. So I can tell it failed in this particular schema element. Now, whenever a workflow fails, if you see a failed workflow token, or you happen to notice in the schema that it failed, the first thing I always do in those cases is go straight to the variables tab. Now I know some of you are fans of logs and you'll probably jump straight to logs, but I'd actually encourage you to go to the variables tab for a reason I'll tell you in a moment. So let's actually go there. So every workflow token has a variables tab, and if we had variables in this workflow, variables are used for storing information. If we had variables in this workflow, which we don't, this is a very simple workflow with no variables. If we had variables, they would show up here. We'd see the name of all the variables, their types, the value of each variable. But again, we don't have any variables in this particular workflow. What we do have is something called an exception message. Now, the exception message can say anything at all. I set the exception message in this case to exception messages are useful when debugging. That's not the only use case for exceptions, but that's definitely a use case. Now, typically an exception message isn't going to say this exactly, but rather it's going to give diagnostic information about what failed, why it failed. So as I said before, when you see a workflow fail, I encourage you to go to the Workflows tab and go to the exception field, because there will always be an exception message. On the other hand, there may or may not be a message in the Logs tab. If there is, these are messages that are either being sent by the person who wrote the Orchestrator workflow, or some messages, like the one you see here, are actually being sent by Orchestrator itself. So we now know how to run a workflow. We know what workflow tokens are. We can see from the workflow tokens whether they succeeded or failed. There are some other icons that will show up on workflow tokens, such as a green triangle indicates that the workflow is currently running. Another icon you'll see at times looks like a little person. A little person icon indicates that the workflow is waiting on something called user interaction. User interaction, one use of user interactions is for approvals. If that makes sense to you, great. If not, don't worry. We'll talk about user interactions later in this video series. Now there's something else I'd like to show you in here called the Inventory tab. That's this tab over here. If we click on the Inventory tab, what we see here is a list of all the plugins that are installed into, in this case, into my Orchestrator server. Your list of plugins will quite possibly be different from mine. For each plugin that chooses to integrate with this thing called the inventory, you will have an entry for the plugin. For instance, our vCenter plugin is showing up down here. And if you expand any of these plugins, they will show you information about the objects or the things that they're managing. Now in this particular case here, you may have noticed I hit the triangle and the vCenter plugin didn't provide me any information. And that's because this particular plugin hasn't not yet been configured. It's installed, but not yet configured. So I thought I'd use this as an opportunity to show you how to run a workflow to configure a newly installed plugin. So why don't we do that? So to configure the vCenter plugin, I'm going to leave the inventory and go back to the Workflows tab. When you go back to the Workflows tab, let me close my folder and let's go back to the Library folder. In the Library folder, the vCenter plugin has its workflows in the folder labeled vCenter. And amongst other things in here, in the vCenter folder, there is that VM folder. Let me collapse that too. In the vCenter folder, there's a folder titled Configuration. Lots of plugins have a folder called Configuration. And what's in that configuration folder is the one or more workflows that you need in order to configure that particular plugin. So let's see what workflows we have in here. The vCenter plugin for Orchestrator includes a workflow called Add a vCenter Server Instance. So right now my Orchestrator server, as we just saw in the inventory, my Orchestrator server doesn't know about any vCenter servers. So how do we run a workflow? I'll pause for a moment to let that be a pop quiz and you can see if you can answer that yourself. But I'm sure you already know there are several different ways of running a workflow. So I'm going to right click and choose Start Workflow. Now, unlike the previous workflows, this workflow is popping up a window to ask me to answer some questions. Now we actually call these, and we'll talk about these later, these questions that are asked when you run the workflow are called input parameters. So one of the questions this workflow is asking is it wants to know the host name or IP address of my vCenter server. Now in my case, that's a machine called vc.vvork.info. Obviously your vCenter server name is going to be different. The next question it's asking is what port number is that vCenter server listening on? 443 is the default for vCenter servers, and you'll notice that input parameters in Orchestrator workflows can have default values. So I'm just going to go with the default port number, the default path name. If you want to know why that port number and what this /SDK business is, come join me in the classroom and I'd be happy to talk with you about it. But further down below, we've got a question about whether or not we want to orchestrate this vCenter server. I'm going to say yes. And furthermore, we have another pair of radio buttons here that allow me, if I say yes, to instruct Orchestrator that it's okay if we encounter a self-signed certificate. The communications between an Orchestrator server and a vCenter server are encrypted using SSL encryption, which means we need an SSL certificate, and that's one of the things that this workflow is going to do behind the scenes. It's going to go to my vCenter server, it's going to download the SSL certificate, and in my case, it's going to notice that there is a self-signed certificate. Since there's a self-signed certificate, if you're familiar with self-signed certificates, you know that that's going to generate a warning. Essentially what I'm doing here is saying just ignore that warning. I'm going to click Next. And you'll notice that sometimes there's so many input parameters, the Orchestrator workflow developer will divide them up into different screens, or these are actually called steps. So here we are in step number 2. Now this question here is essentially, these questions are asking me how I want my Orchestrator server to authenticate to the vCenter server. Without going into a full explanation here, I'm just going to choose no and type my credentials for my vCenter server. So I don't want to, ignore that warning message there, I don't want to log in as VCO admin into the vCenter server because I don't have an account there called that. What I do have is an account called administrator at vvork.info. You probably have an account called administrator at something. Obviously the domain name portion of your account name will be different. And your password is quite possibly different. I'll type my password, you type yours. And then after having answered all the questions, we'll click Submit. And then this workflow will run and configure Orchestrator so that it can communicate with my vCenter server. Take a look over at the token. There's that green triangle button I talked about before that indicates the workflow is running. So let's give the workflow a few moments to run. And as you can see, it's now done. Now, part of the reason why I'm doing this, this whole business of running the vCenter plugin is because I know that later on in this video series, I'm going to show you how to use the vCenter plugin. So if you haven't actually been following along and doing the steps to run this workflow to configure your Orchestrator server to speak to your vCenter server, you're going to need to do that before you get too much further in the videos. Okay, so now we've configured our vCenter server, I should say configured our Orchestrator server so it knows about our vCenter server, and I'm going to go back to that inventory tab, which you'll recall previously when we went to vCenter it was empty, but now we can see this entry here is my vCenter server, and if I go drilling down through this hierarchical inventory, I can see all the objects that I'm accustomed to seeing using other tools such as the vSphere web client. So as I go in through here, as you can see, I can see all my data center folders, my data centers, my hosts, if I had a cluster, I could see my clusters, I could see my hosts, I can see my data stores, my resource pools, my networks, and so forth. Not only that, another thing that you can do, actually let me expand a little bit further. You'll notice, hang on a sec here, you'll notice that we can also see virtual machines. Now for any of these types of objects, it's quite possible that the person who developed this plugin has taken advantage of a really cool feature here. They don't always do this, but it's really neat when they do. I can right-click on any object. Let me pick this virtual machine, for instance. I can right-click any object. A window will pop up. I can choose Run Workflow. And what I get here is a list of workflows that are appropriate for that type of object. So for instance, if I wanted to upgrade VMware tools in that virtual machine, I could select this workflow, click Select, and run that workflow and update VMware tools. If I want to, I can shut down and delete the machine. Now, I don't think I want to do that with this particular VM because that is my Orchestrator server. But the point is pretty straightforward here, that there's all sorts of different things that we can do by invoking these workflows. And these are, by the way, the very same workflows that we were seeing over in the Workflows tab. So the inventory essentially does two things for you. It allows you to, well, let's call it three things. One, you can see all the plugins. Two, you can see a hierarchical structure that lets you know about the objects that each plugin is managing. And the third thing you can do is right-click on any of the objects and you'll get a list of whatever workflows the developer wants to expose to you. And again, those will be context sensitive. If you right-click a virtual machine, you get virtual machine workflows. All right, so that's actually it for this video. If you feel like you've mastered all the techniques we've talked about, in particular running workflows, great. And in that case, what we'll do is we'll wrap up this video. I'll see you over in the next video. That's video number 4, where I'm going to show you how to create your own workflow. So see you in video 4.